Bernie Sanders turnout tanks, but why? This is Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, we've just gotten through another set of primaries, about 6 of them, including Missouri, Mississippi, Michigan, Idaho, North Dakota, and another that's escaping my memory. And Joe Biden has done well, and Bernie Sanders has done poorly. And in places where Bernie Sanders did well in 2016, he completely flipped, especially Michigan. And there were some counties in Michigan where he was up 25 points over Hillary Clinton in 2016, and he's down 25 points versus Joe Biden in 2020. But I thought the most interesting aspect of the early information I saw about these returns was the continuing story of lower voter turnout, but specifically with Bernie Sanders, the quadrennial or biennial hope that the youth vote will come out and the passion that they have for a candidate, and then their absence at the polls. Bill, is this just more of the same, or why is it that young people have such a hard time showing up for a single day, for a few minutes, for the thing that they say is an existentially important moment in time?
See, now that's the part that's actually kind of interesting. Because before you finish the sentence, I was saying, have you never been a young person? There's hardly anything when you're in your teens or 20s that you show up for that you don't want to show up for. And I'm thinking back about all my years in college, and I didn't vote until I didn't vote for president until 1984. I got to college in 79, and even then I didn't really care very much. I really didn't. I felt like it was just a civic duty. So the idea that young people don't go out and do things they don't want to do is not particularly news to me.
But that's not my question. It's the question is how can they be so passionate about a person and then not show up?
I'm getting to that. So the idea that young people don't go out and do something you don't want to do is not news to me. But what is interesting, fascinating, and certainly worth discussion is, as you say, why won't they get up and do something they don't want to do on one day when they have built their entire lives around this whole idea of social justice and social protest and the patriarchy and all the other things that need to be smashed while providing them with, iPhones and Starbucks and all the rest of it? That's the question. And to me, I think there's really only kind of one answer for that. If you look at historical elections where there was a candidate who captured young people's imagination and fired them up, they did turn out in large numbers. Probably Robert F. Kennedy is the one that comes to mind more than anyone. But I remember a number of candidates that were Gary Hart was really just people were on fire for these guys, and this not so much. And it's almost like there's an inverse relationship between the amount of emotion that young people are showing towards Bernie versus how willing they are to actually get out and do it. This kind of goes to my theory, which I think gathers more evidence every day, that socialism for them is not a political construct. It's not a political idea. It's a status idea. That's what I'm coming to think of more.
It's a way to signal
day.
To your friends who you are.
It's a $250 pair of Nikes, Scott. For people who are against $250 pair of Nikes.
Let me give you some data on this, Bill, because and this is from a story I read today about coverage, and now we're about 48 hours out from Tuesday's election as people are seeing this. Voters under 45 years old were 41% of the electorate in 2016. Those same voters accounted for only 32% of the electorate in 2020. And then
what was the first number?
The first number was 41%, drops to 32%. These are people under age 45. And then the biggest jump, the increase in share of the electorate, came among Mr. Biden's strongest group, those 65 and older. 2016, they were just 22% of the electorate, up to 31% this time. So far from what the popular narrative has been, that the youth is impassioned now and inflamed and is inspired and is going to show up. In fact, quite the opposite happened. Not only did they not show up in massive numbers, but the elderly did.
Well, the elderly know what socialism is, having they didn't have to be taught history. They get to watch it. I can't remember exactly what the 4 adjectives used on young people, but fired up, passionate, inflamed, and ready to go to work, something along those lines. They're 3 out of 4. But like I say, Scott, I think this makes a lot more sense if you begin to look at this the way I'm certainly beginning to look at it. And I think the evidence for this is stronger every day. And furthermore, I think the evidence goes across many different sectors of society, and not just how people politically, get up and vote. I really, with every passing day, I become more and more convinced that socialism is a fashion statement. And the first glimpse I had of this was 10 full years ago now, practically. And I've told this story many times, but I've told this story way too many times, but about having dealt with an audience in Oberlin College and said, well, if you're a real socialist, bring your cell phones down and we'll pawn them. We'll distribute the money to poor people. And they didn't do it. They didn't do it because they're not really socialists. Committed socialists, the kind of people you might see in the 60s, would have done that. They would have done that. They would have signed up for the Peace Corps. They would have gone overseas. The young ideologists of the 60s and even into a little bit later into the 70s were actually doing things. They were putting their money where their mouth was. And we don't see any of that today. And I think it's because it's a fashion statement. It's a bumper sticker. And the age of the bumper sticker is the age of when we talk about virtue signaling. The reason we call it virtue signaling is because it's not virtue. There's a difference between virtue and virtue signaling. Being virtuous is doing something that you perceive to be good. We may not agree on what that is, but at least you're doing it. If you're a young left winger in America and you think that American imperialism and corporatism has basically turned the whole world poor, I completely disagree with you. But if you believe that and you join the Peace Corps and you go and do 3 years in Uganda or something, then you're putting your money where your mouth is, because it's a political belief, it's a philosophical belief. I think that this is a fashion statement. And the reason I think that is because the behavior of the people involved is not the behavior of socialists. Most of the young men who are of that age group, who call themselves Bernie supporters, play video games. And as I've said 100,000 times, all you do in a video game is make money and buy weapons. They go to play video games so they can act like conservatives. They don't sell their own property. They don't seem to be coming out in large numbers to build, low-income housing on Sunday mornings. And if they do, they go once. This whole thing is a kind of a posture. And as always, I have to constantly bring myself back to the fact that this millennial generation that we seem to be mostly talking about didn't ask for any of this. They didn't raise themselves and they didn't educate themselves. But if you think about it, if you really think about it, they have been given trophies for showing up. Now, that at first may seem counterintuitive, because what they're doing in the actual polls is not showing up. But when I say they get credit for showing up, what I mean is victory or defeat in that kind of nightmare that we created for them, that self-esteem fantasy, means that it doesn't matter whether you win or lose. You get the trophy for showing up. And so when I say they get the trophy for showing up, they get the trophy for calling themselves socialists, wearing the badge of socialism, being able to talk about how they care about the needs of other people and how deeply concerned they are about the poor as they sit and read on their iPhones, and how deeply concerned they are about plastic as they continue to drink their bottled water and all the rest of it. It's like we have shown up, present. That's all we need to do.
So, Bill, let me contrast the youth vote and the failure of them to arrive in consequential numbers on behalf of Bernie Sanders, a candidate for whom they professed great love and frankly went door to door for, spent time on social media advocating, talked to their friends about. Contrast that not only with elderly people who showed up for Joe Biden, but also with the people who really showed up for Joe Biden, and that's Black Americans. The Mississippi count was particularly stunning, with Biden getting something like 80% of the vote. There's a question about whether Bernie Sanders Sanders will have the threshold, which is 15%, in order to even get any delegates in Mississippi because of that. And in other states, black voters have continued to show up in large numbers for Joe Biden. James Clyburn, Representative James Clyburn, who's famed for his involvement in the civil rights movement, but also his long tenure in Congress, and endorsed Joe Biden right before the primaries at a time when it really mattered.
That may have been the crucial moment of the 2020 campaign.
Many think it was the turning point. That's right. He says to the Democratic National Committee, shut this primary down, cancel the rest of the debates. How do you explain, Bill, the enthusiasm for Joe Biden beyond just the fact that he served as a relatively silent partner for 8 years of Barack Obama's presidency?
Scott, I can state with, I think, near certainty that there is essentially no enthusiasm for Joe Biden. None. I have not heard of, seen, I have not, in the entire process that we've been through. In fact, during the entire 4 years during the entire time he was vice president, I have never seen anybody who is a passionate supporter of Joe Biden. What people are turning out for I think are different things. I think that the elderly people are turning out against Bernie Sanders. Elderly Democrats came out against Bernie Sanders. I think that's crystal clear. And Biden was basically the only choice. I think Black Americans turned out for Biden because they find Bernie Sanders particularly unappealing, especially since Bernie's ideas about job destruction and placing kind of political theory above actual practical jobs is anathema to most people who have any contact with reality. But I think the whole thing is powered basically at this point by the Democrats who came out and voted for Biden, not because of Biden, but because they knew that Bernie Sanders wasn't going to be able to beat Trump. And furthermore, they didn't want Bernie Sanders even if he did.
Bill, I don't have the data to back up this statement, but I will tell you in conversations with people at my other job, I was taken aback actually by the enthusiasm of some of my colleagues for Joe Biden. And the sense I got, and this is just a sense, it's not, they didn't say this directly, is that many Black American Democrats believe that Joe Biden was there for them at crucial points in their history, that he identifies with them in ways that Bernie Sanders never really has. In fact, Sanders actually, between Super Tuesday and the most recent primaries in Michigan, Mississippi, and elsewhere, Bernie Sanders actually scrapped plans to give a speech on social justice that may have, that had racial implications and that may have buttressed his support in that community. He just didn't give the speech. And yet Biden is constantly appealing to African Americans. Do you think just the fact that he identifies with them helps them to identify with him?
I can't see anything and I hate dividing the country up into these kind of groups,
Sure.
But this is how the game is played. I can't see any appeal for Bernie Sanders to Black American voters, none. Now, Biden can tell the story about having been there all the way, and there's no question about that. If for no other reason, he was vice president to Barack Obama for 8 years. And so when Bernie Sanders, when Joe Biden says he's been with Black Americans this whole time, he's right. The unfortunate thing is that when he's been with Black America has suffered horrifically, and they'll continue to do so as long as they stay associated with people like Joe Biden, who walk into crowds of Black American voters and say that Republicans want to put you back in chains, therefore vote for us, and they do, and then they remain in these Democratic-controlled murder pits, and the cycle continues. But what matters is not that Biden carried an enormous amount of the black vote, because the Democrats have to carry 80%, 85% of the black vote in order to win the national election. But the two things that matter here are, number one, this was Joe Biden's numbers versus Bernie Sanders. What Joe Biden's numbers versus Donald Trump will be again in the black community is an entirely different animal. I cannot imagine a candidate more repulsive to Black America than Bernie Sanders, who has led a life of absolute ease and who appeals to primarily spoiled white college kids. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has got a whole different hand to play against them. But the real thing that interests me, and I don't have this information, but this is really, really big. I want to know what the black turnout for Joe Biden is relative to the black turnout for Barack Obama. Or Hillary Clinton, for that matter.
Well, in the coming days, I'm sure we'll see that kind of data. Bill, it occurred to me while you were saying this that Bernie Sanders' campaign largely rests on his advocacy of certain policies or certain political ideas. Joe Biden's campaign rests on his connection with people. And I had a congressman back in Pennsylvania who's retired from Congress now, but I remember being struck by watching him move around a crowd. There was nobody in that room, no matter what their ideology or political proclivities, that wasn't seen as his friend. And in fact, he would seek out people who disagreed with him and literally come up, put his arm around their shoulder and say, "Hey, brother, I was thinking about you the other day. You're going to love this." And he would tell them a story about something. And it seems to me that Biden has built his campaign on connecting with African Americans, connecting with elderly people, connecting with union voters, connecting with people on a friendship level rather than on a policy level. If you said, "Hey, what are Joe Biden's main policy initiatives?" you'd have to go, "Well, I don't know. What do Democrats stand for?"
I had a relatively benign view of Joe Biden right up into the vice presidential debate against Paul Ryan in 2012. And this perpetual, I just said, this guy's he's just not a good man. He definitely can play it. And you're right. Joe Biden Joe Biden's been in Congress for 133 years now, something like that. And you only get to do that by being able to maintain that sense. I'm not going to call it an illusion because I don't know what goes on inside Joe Biden's mind. I'm sure Joe Biden genuinely feels like he's the best thing for Black America. I don't really doubt that he thinks that. But Joe Biden has that traditional politician character, and that tends to be Democrats usually. That personal touch. It's kind of Bill Clinton had this in spades. He just absolutely had so much of it. But it's that kind of boss tweed, kind of kingfish kind of thing. It's like, hey, bro, I haven't seen you in a long time. How you been? How's your daughter? Louise, and all the rest of this stuff. But that folksiness, and that's what he was selling, folksiness. And he was, and as you say, when you saw him in this room, he looked like he was everybody's friend. He made an effort to connect with voters and make friends with them and so on. That guy's long gone. As Joe Biden's mental deterioration continues, the first thing that goes, we had a conversation about this specifically on, I guess it was on one of our right angle shows. The first thing that goes is your memory, as Alzheimer's starts to kick in, and then comes the dementia. And the dementia is shocking. It's shocking. The most gentle people, kindest people you ever knew suddenly become absolutely combative, vulgar, and start using expletives that they just didn't even think they knew. And we're seeing this already. When Joe Biden is in a friendly environment and tells people to shut the F up or hey, fat, or hey, you dog-faced pony soldier, or whatever he called these people. This is Joe Biden basically destroying the only currency he has. It's not a great intellect. I think we can all agree that's not Joe Biden's primary quality is his great intellectual depth. It's certainly not his history of success in business or anything else. Not even his history of success in politics. South Carolina was the first primary he'd won since he'd been in politics. It'd been 4 decades. So all Joe has was that kind of, hey, you know what? Let's just get together and make this country better and stop all the hatred and the anger that Donald Trump has delivered to the country. And when you get that guy in a situation where he's talking to union guys with wearing hard hats and starting to tell them, to just literally start poking them in the chest, it's done. I mean, what do you say about that? What else has he got? And he doesn't have that anymore.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful that you not only watch this show, but that so many of you have become members at BillWhittle.com and are the producers of this show, are the team that make it possible for us to spread these messages around the world. Those folks joined up by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking that Become a Member link. We're also grateful to our friends over at the Patriot Post, and we'll provide a link to them in the description below. In addition to the normal, just great content that you get at the Patriot Post, they are offering right now a free Patriots primer on American liberty that you're really going to enjoy, not only for your own edification, but for its ability to help you communicate more effectively the ideas and foundational principles of this country to those around you, especially to young people. So make sure you click that link in the description below so that you can get your American Liberty primer from Patriot Post. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.